There comes a time in a man's life where he begins to understand that the true measure of his strength is not in what he says, but in what he chooses not to say. It's not the grand gestures, the eloquent words, or the charming lines that redefine how a woman sees him. It's the moment he chooses silence when the world expects noise. This silence isn't passive. It's not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but rather the silence of someone who no longer feels the need to be understood, validated, or appeased. Imagine she provokes you, maybe with sarcasm, a passive-aggressive remark, or an emotional withdrawal, expecting you to react, to chase, to clarify, to plead for clarity or connection. Most men fall right into that trap. They raise their voice, argue, explain, try to fix the tension because they fear losing connection. But the man who truly understands his power does something radically different. He doesn't react at all. He doesn't blink. He doesn't explain. He simply holds his ground in calm, effortless stillness, a slight smile, a relaxed breath, and complete emotional presence. He becomes a mirror that reflects her emotional chaos without absorbing it. And that lack of reaction, the refusal to participate in emotional drama, isn't weakness. It's the ultimate display of inner mastery. It says, "I am not here to be moved by your storm. I am the calm that makes your storm irrelevant." She expects an argument, a chase, a reaction, because that's what most men do. But when she encounters the man who doesn't fall for the bait, who simply allows the discomfort to exist without trying to escape it, something inside her changes. Her mental map of him begins to shift. He becomes unpredictable. He becomes unknowable, and in that unknowability lies his allure. Because what people can't predict, they can't control. And what they can't control, they can't stop thinking about. She no longer sees him as just another guy trying to win her attention. He becomes a puzzle her mind keeps trying to solve, an emotional experience she can't neatly categorize. That single moment, that one calm, grounded pause, where he does absolutely nothing except remain centered, disrupts her expectations. It creates a crack in the narrative she's built about men and power and attraction. And through that crack, something new enters: respect, intrigue, even desire. He's not proving anything, but everything about him feels proven. He's not detached, but deeply rooted. He's not trying to be mysterious, but his self-restraint makes him a mystery. And that, paradoxically, makes her feel more emotionally invested than any passionate plea ever could. In a world where most men are reactive, this man becomes rare. In a culture that glorifies instant gratification and over-explaining, his silence becomes sacred. And it isn't silence for silence's sake. It's the kind of silence that speaks volumes. The kind that makes her feel something far deeper than words ever could. There's a silence that speaks louder than any emotional outburst, louder than words filled with frustration or pain. It is not the silence of defeat, nor is it the silence of fear. It is the silence of self-respect, a man choosing peace over chaos, sovereignty over submission. Most men, when faced with a woman's emotional inconsistency, when her attention becomes erratic, her communication vague, or her affection begins to feel calculated, panic. They feel a compulsion to fix it, to understand it, to reach out and regain footing. They ask questions, they demand answers, they express confusion, and in doing so, they give away one of their most sacred possessions, their energy. But the man who truly knows himself does not run into the fire of confusion. He does not chase after clarity when clarity isn't being offered with sincerity. He doesn't need her to explain what she's doing because he already understands this fundamental truth. Games are a signal that respect is slipping. And where there is no respect, there can be no connection worth saving. When a woman starts to pull away subtly, starts engaging in emotional tactics that feel more like manipulation than connection, she is testing something. She is looking for a reaction. She wants to see if she can shake his ground, if his center can be unbalanced. But the Stoic man doesn't flinch. He doesn't ask, "What's wrong?" He doesn't beg for her to return to who she used to be. He doesn't try to make her comfortable again. He does something infinitely more powerful. He walks away, not with noise, not with anger, but with grace, not to punish her, not to teach her a lesson, but because he values his peace more than her confusion. He vanishes without a dramatic send-off, no long text messages, no emotional monologue, just silence, just absence, and that silence lands like thunder in her world. Because she expected him to fight for her attention. She expected him to chase after her approval. She expected a reaction, and instead, she's met with a void, a space that she created, but did not anticipate to feel so heavy. This absence is not an empty gesture. It's a complete interruption of the emotional script she was writing. She expected him to play a role, the man who always seeks answers, the man who can't handle distance, the man who will trade dignity for proximity. But instead, she's left standing in the presence of a man who refuses to play the game. His silence echoes longer than any fight would have. It lingers in her thoughts. It raises questions. Why didn't he ask why I pulled back? Why didn't he try to fix it? Why didn't he care enough to respond? And then comes the real question. Did I lose something valuable and didn't even realize it until now? And that's when the emotional shift begins. He becomes the one who slipped through her fingers, the one she underestimated, the one who wasn't attached by need, but only by intention. And when intention is no longer met with respect, he walks. That's what distinguishes him from the crowd. He doesn't beg to be understood. He doesn't argue for his value. He lets his absence become the statement. And that absence, over time, reveals far more about his worth than presence ever could. While other men are still explaining, still trying to prove themselves, still begging to be heard, he's gone, already building a life that honors his peace, because he knows that being tolerated is not the same as being cherished. And he refuses to shrink to fit into someone's uncertainty. His withdrawal isn't about punishment, it's protection, it's preservation of self, it's the realization that connection should never come at the cost of one's soul. So when he walks away without saying a word, it's not silence, it's power. And for the woman who thought she held the reins, the silence becomes deafening, confusing, disorienting. The energy has shifted, and she knows it. The dynamic has flipped, not because he overpowered her, but because he chose not to compete at all. And nothing is more powerful than a man who no longer tries to win where he is no longer honored. In a society that thrives on speed, immediacy, and instant feedback, there's something profoundly magnetic about a man who does not rush, who moves with intention, and who refuses to let urgency dictate his responses. Most men, upon receiving a message from a woman they're interested in, instantly reply. They drop everything, cancel their plans, pause their goals, forget their priorities, all to show that they are available, interested, and emotionally invested. They do it thinking it communicates care, attentiveness, and desire. But what it really does, over time, is erode their mystery, their edge, and their perceived value. Because availability without boundaries isn't romantic, it's forgettable. A man who always replies instantly becomes expected. He becomes easy to predict, and in emotional dynamics, predictability leads to complacency. The spark begins to fade not because he's a bad man, but because he has made himself too emotionally accessible too soon. And in doing so, he has unknowingly surrendered one of the most important aspects of attraction, tension. But the man who doesn't rush to respond, the man who delays not out of arrogance, but because he's genuinely invested in his own mission, his own path, his own growth, he becomes a different kind of presence. He teaches her, through his actions, that his time is not something to be taken lightly, that his attention is not always on stand-by, that while he may care, he does not chase. His life is rich with purpose, and any woman who enters it must align with that energy, not disrupt it. This kind of man is not withholding affection. He's expressing a deeper truth, that connection is sacred, not scattered, that attention should be intentional, not impulsive. When she sends a message and hours go by with no reply, not because he's playing games, but because he's present in his life, her mind begins to wander, not out of insecurity, but out of intrigue. What is he doing? Who is he with? What is keeping his attention? And in that space, in that silence, attraction builds, because now she is reaching into a mystery. She is leaning forward. She is sensing the difference between him and every other man who made himself instantly available. And when they speak again, when he responds, there is weight behind his presence. His words carry more gravity because they are not scattered in 1,000 directions. He's not reacting, he's choosing. And that simple, deliberate energy shift does more than charm her. It grounds her. She realizes he's not seeking entertainment. He's not filling time. He's not using her attention to validate himself. He is whole, complete, and selective. And in being selective, he elevates his worth. She begins to realize that being in his life is not a given. It's a privilege, that she's not being ignored. She's being challenged. And feminine energy at its core craves challenge, not hostility, but conquest. The emotional journey, the experience of wondering, the delicious uncertainty that makes her lean in rather than lean back. When a man delays a reply, not with cruelty but with intention, he is creating emotional polarity. He is establishing that he's not emotionally desperate, that his center isn't shaken by her presence or absence. And that is exactly what draws her in. He's not on his phone waiting for validation. He's in motion. He's focused. He's doing something meaningful. And when he finally speaks, it's not to seek approval, it's to connect from a place of fullness. That kind of energy cannot be faked. It cannot be mimicked through tactics or strategies. It has to be lived. It has to be earned. Because a man who doesn't chase time, who doesn't chase people, who doesn't chase attention, he becomes the man others chase. Not because he plays games, but because his peace is too precious to be interrupted by every message, every whim, every passing mood. He teaches her, slowly but clearly, that emotional urgency doesn't move him, that the foundation of connection with him is not based on how quickly he replies, but how deeply he listens when he does, that his world doesn't revolve around her attention, it revolves around purpose. And in that purpose she finds herself more captivated than she ever was by grand romantic gestures, because this kind of man is not giving affection for free, he is offering presence, and presence is far more rare. When he finally sits down and replies, or calls back, or makes time, it's not because he has nothing else going on. It's because he chose that moment, and that deliberate energy hits differently. It carries gravity, meaning, and undeniable allure. Because she now understands his attention is not cheap, his time is not desperate, his presence is not reactive. It is earned, it is sacred, and it leaves an impression far deeper than any instant response ever could. There comes a moment in every interaction, every relationship, where the subtle test arises. The moment when you are asked, sometimes directly but often in a quiet, implied way, to bend. It could be a small favor cloaked in charm. It could be a request that undermines your priorities. It could be disguised as a compromise, a gentle nudge to cancel your workout, skip your plans, break your rhythm. And many men, in the name of keeping peace, maintaining harmony, or appearing kind, say yes. They go along, they adjust, they justify their agreement, they explain their reasoning in a way that seems polite, but is actually rooted in fear. The fear of upsetting her, the fear of losing her, the fear of not being liked. And though it seems harmless in the moment, each of those justifications chips away at something sacred, your authority over your own life. The man who is unsure of himself explains every no. He feels the need to be understood. He softens his boundaries with excessive reasoning. He thinks, if she understands why I'm saying no, she won't be upset. But in doing so, he reveals something far more important, that his decisions are negotiable, that his sense of self is dependent on her emotional comfort, that he will bend his priorities if she applies just the right amount of pressure, and once that is sin, even unconsciously, it can't be unseen. Her respect begins to shift. She may not say it, but she feels it. A man who justifies his boundaries is already standing on unstable ground, but then there is the man who says no, and stops right there, not out of aggression, not from a place of arrogance, but from a place of deep alignment with who he is and what matters to him. His no is clean, it's quiet, it doesn't tremble, it carries a kind of finality that speaks not just to her request, but to the foundation he's built his life upon. And that foundation becomes visible to her in that exact moment, because when a man says no without explaining, he reveals that his boundaries are not up for debate. He is not trying to be agreeable. He is being real. His decisions are not shaped by temporary moods or emotional pressure. They are rooted in his values, his rhythm, his internal compass, and a woman may test that, intentionally or not, just to see if it holds. Because what she really wants to know is, can I trust him to lead? Can I trust him to stay anchored when I am not? And when his no holds firm, without panic, without guilt, without trembling, she finds something she didn't even know she was searching for: emotional safety. This safety doesn't come from him always agreeing with her. It doesn't come from him always saying yes. It comes from the consistency of his truth. A man who can say no calmly, clearly, and without the need to convince her, is a man who protects not just his own peace, but the integrity of the connection itself. He teaches her, without words, that love isn't about endless accommodation. That connection isn't built on sacrificing your own needs to meet someone else's in every moment. That real love includes limits, and that limits are a form of care. Because a man who betrays his own values to please her cannot be trusted to lead with strength when life becomes hard. And life will become hard, so when he says no, not with coldness, but with certainty, she sees something rare. She sees that his world doesn't revolve around pleasing her. It revolves around truth. It revolves around clarity. And that's what she'll trust in the long run, because while the agreeable man may win her smile in the moment, it is the man of principle who wins her respect over time, and respect is the soil from which real connection grows. He doesn't offer his no with a wall of distance. He offers it with warmth and resolve, and in that space she learns to adjust, not because he demanded it, but because his standards require it. She sees that this is a man who cannot be emotionally manipulated, who does not fear temporary disapproval, who does not crumble under pressure, and that becomes the container in which her own feminine energy can soften, knowing it is met with steadiness, not with emotional volatility. And what's even more magnetic is the paradox it creates. The more he holds his line, the more she wants to understand him. The more grounded he remains in his decisions, the more she respects his leadership. The more he prioritizes alignment over approval, the more she leans in, wanting to be a part of the world he protects so fiercely. His no doesn't push her away, it pulls her closer, not because of dominance, but because of clarity. Because in a world of blurred lines, flexible standards, and men who bend at every storm, a man who knows how to say no becomes unforgettable. Not because he makes her feel small, but because he invites her into something greater, a dynamic built on truth, anchored in values, and free from the need for constant validation. And once she experiences that, once she feels that firm but warm resistance, she sees the kind of man she's not used to encountering, the kind who leads without force, the kind who says no not to push her out, but to protect what's worth keeping in. There is an emotional dynamic that most men never fully grasp, the ability to create closeness without clinging, to show care without collapsing into neediness, to give affection not as a transaction, but as a reflection of fullness. Most men have been conditioned to believe that to win a woman's heart, they must constantly give more time, more affection, more words, more emotional availability. They believe that consistent giving will foster connection, will deepen intimacy, will make her feel safe and loved. But what they fail to understand is that overgiving without restraint often comes from a place of lack, from the subconscious belief that love must be earned through constant effort. And ironically, the more a man gives without boundaries, the less his presence is felt. Because when there is no contrast, no pause, no space, the value of his energy is diluted. He becomes expected, he becomes familiar, he becomes ordinary, but there is a different kind of man, a man who knows how to pull her close and then let her go. Not because he's detached or manipulative, but because he operates from a place of emotional sovereignty. When he embraces her, when he looks into her eyes, when he kisses her forehead or holds her in silence, he's fully present. He gives her the richness of his energy without hesitation, but he never loses himself in the moment. He never becomes desperate to prolong the closeness or control what happens next. And that is what creates the paradox, a touch so full of depth, yet paired with the discipline to release her. This man knows that the moment he clings, the moment he chases emotional security through constant nearness, he begins to erode the very polarity that makes connection powerful. So he lets go, not abruptly, not coldly, but with grounded presence. This restraint is not an act, it's not a calculated tactic, it's the product of inner maturity. Most men think restraint means suppression, that to hold back affection is to be emotionally distant. But real restraint is not about withholding from fear, it's about offering from fullness. A man who pulls her in, holds her, connects deeply, and then gently steps away does something that very few understand. He creates space, And in that space, her desire grows, not because he is teasing her, but because he has shown her that his love is not rooted in need, that he doesn't require constant reassurance to feel whole, that he can be close and connected, yet walk away with peace in his heart and confidence in his path. And that, for a woman, is electric, it's haunting. It lingers in her memory longer than grand declarations or elaborate romantic gestures, because it wasn't the closeness that struck her. It was the contrast, the fact that she could feel him so deeply and then suddenly miss him, even as he walked just a few feet away. When he can love her without clinging, give to her without draining himself, and connect without collapsing his identity, he offers her something rare, presence without pressure. He shows her that she is not the center of his emotional world, that while he values her, cherishes her, and honors the connection, he does not depend on it to feel complete, and this emotional independence is what creates true polarity. Because feminine energy is drawn to strength, not just physical strength or assertiveness, but the deeper strength of a man who can stand in love without losing himself in it. The man who knows how to walk through intensity without being consumed by it. The man who can touch her soul and then return to himself, centered, clear, and steady. And it's in those moments, the way he releases her hand just a second sooner than expected, the way he ends the embrace not because he wants less, but because he values tension, that she begins to feel something she doesn't with other men. A longing, a curiosity, a hunger to be closer even when closeness just happened, because he's not feeding her comfort on demand. He's creating an emotional rhythm, a rise and fall, a give and pause, a dance between fullness and absence that keeps her engaged on a level deeper than logic. She may not be able to explain it, but she feels it. She feels that he's not emotionally starving, that his love isn't a plea, that his presence isn't a performance. And that gives her the freedom to open, to trust, to surrender, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through mastery of his own emotions. This kind of man doesn't use closeness as a strategy. He uses it as an offering, a gift given not to get something in return, but because he has something to give. And when he lets go, it's not abandonment, it's invitation. An invitation for her to come closer on her own terms, to meet him not as a needful filler, but as a partner in energy. And that emotional experience stays with her, it marks her, because most men never show it. Most men chase, overgive, and then wonder why their efforts are taken for granted. But the man who knows how to step back, who knows how to release with presence and power, becomes unforgettable. Not because of how much he gives, but because of how he gives it, completely, and then steps away, leaving her not with emptiness, but with longing, intrigue, and the deep impression of a man who is emotionally whole. There is a kind of transformation that doesn't happen with noise, declarations, or fireworks. It happens in silence. It happens in the way a man carries himself when he no longer seeks validation, when he no longer positions his worth in someone else's gaze. Most men are loud in their pursuit of love. They try to show they care, to prove they're good enough, to demonstrate their loyalty, hoping that someone will see them, choose them, keep them. They exhaust themselves performing for affection, confusing attention with connection and mistaking constant availability for value. But there comes a point, if a man is willing to look deeply enough within, where that need to be seen by others dissolves, where he realizes he was never meant to bend himself for love, but to become so grounded in who he is that love recognizes him, not because he begged for it, but because his presence made it impossible to ignore. The moment a man stops chasing is the moment everything changes, not just with women, but within himself. He begins to see that his worth isn't found in being chosen. It's in being aligned. He starts acting, speaking, and showing up from a place of truth, not strategy. He doesn't suppress who he is to fit into someone else's expectation. He doesn't shift his energy to keep someone comfortable. He doesn't explain every choice to avoid being misunderstood, because he understands something essential. The need to be understood is a form of emotional dependency. And when he no longer needs someone else's understanding to remain whole, he becomes untouchable in the best way. His silence begins to say more than his words ever could. His presence begins to carry weight without explanation. And that stillness, that refusal to flinch, to chase, to overcompensate, it speaks to something deep inside her. It awakens her awareness, not of him alone, but of the gap his absence leaves behind. It's not manipulation. It's not a tactic. It's alignment. It's clarity. It's a man stepping fully into his own power and staying there, regardless of how others respond. He no longer plays the game of emotional push and pull. He no longer waits for permission to be confident. He doesn't second guess his decisions based on how someone else might feel about them. His silence is no longer filled with hesitation or passive aggression. It is filled with knowing. He doesn't react to provocation. He doesn't return manipulation with emotion. And he doesn't beg for conversations that aren't being offered with honesty. Instead, he lets the silence speak. And in that silence, a woman begins to hear what words could never say. He is no longer accessible in the way she once expected. He has elevated. He has ascended. He has reclaimed every piece of himself that he used to give away too freely. And that reclamation changes everything. Because when a man is no longer moved by someone's attention, that attention suddenly becomes more desperate to be given. When he no longer orbits around her moods, her validation, her emotional weather, she begins to experience him as a force, not a follower. She begins to question, to reflect, to remember, not because he asked her to, but because he stopped asking for anything at all. And in that energetic reversal, something awakens. She replays their conversations. She thinks about his silence. She wonders why his absence feels heavier than the presence of other men. And the truth is, it's because he didn't leave quietly. He left clearly. His exit wasn't about revenge or ego. It was about evolution. He didn't shrink to maintain peace. He didn't chase to maintain closeness. He simply stood in his power and allowed anything not aligned with that power to fall away. This man no longer exists to be consumed emotionally. He exists to be respected, to be honored, to be met, not saved, not healed, not completed. And that shift is radical. Because in a world where most men are emotionally overexposed, constantly trying to be enough for someone else, this man is simply enough for himself. His no is sacred. His absence is purposeful. His energy is reserved for spaces that nourish his growth and match his depth. And that presence is unforgettable, not because it demands attention, but because it doesn't. He stops performing, he stops proving, he simply embodies, and that embodiment, the stillness in his eyes, the firmness in his boundaries, the peace in his solitude, becomes magnetic. She feels it, even if she doesn't understand it, even if she doesn't have the language to name it. She feels the shift. She feels the lack of neediness. She feels the change in energy, not bitter, not cold, but sovereign. She senses that he is no longer tethered to the emotional strings that once bound him to her moods, her messages, or her withdrawal. And now her curiosity begins to rise, because the one who no longer waits becomes the one who is waited for. The one who no longer chases becomes the one who is chased. The one who no longer proves becomes the one whose silence proves everything. And that man, the man who no longer needs her, the man who no longer waits by the phone, the man who has shifted his entire emotional axis away from external validation and into internal sovereignty, is the man she remembers. Not for what he said, not for what he gave, but for what he withheld, for the peace he protected, for the standard he never lowered, for the self he finally refused to abandon. His transformation didn't make him louder, it made him clearer. His absence didn't create distance, it created contrast, and in that contrast she saw him differently. She felt him more deeply. She realized she never truly understood him when he was always available. But now that he's silent, she hears him. Now that he's gone, she sees him. Now that he's sovereign, she remembers him. Not because he tried to be unforgettable, but because he stopped needing to be remembered at all. And so, in choosing stillness over noise, discipline over desperation, and sovereignty over submission, you don't just change how she sees you, you change how you see yourself. You no longer operate from the fragile place of trying to be chosen. You walk with the quiet knowing that you are the prize. And whether she stays, leaves, returns, or disappears, it doesn't shake your foundation. Because your value is no longer determined by her attention, but by your alignment with your own principles. In a world where most men bend, chase, and explain, you become the rare presence that stands firm. And that is the kind of presence that doesn't beg to be remembered, because it's impossible to forget.